Good morning. Do you believe in low-carbon cities?
Yes, of course. I mean, it's an obvious one, isn't it? The answer's got to be yes. We're driving towards low-carbon, zero-carbon developments. I guess we were in a privileged position with the Red Sea project that we've inherited or were gifted a 28,000 square kilometer territory, which is the size of Belgium, we keep saying. So it's a country-scale project with 90 islands, 200 kilometers of coastline, and the only piece of infrastructure throughout that entire site was a north to south highway called Highway 5, which really connects Jeddah's northern borders with its southern borders. So, a truly pristine destination, and it would be remiss of us, it would be a total failure on our part if we can't develop that in an environmentally sensitive manner that leads over decades to a zero or virtually zero carbon economy.
Lukas, in Masdar you have already tried to get that low carbon or zero carbon city. Can you tell us something about it?
Some of you may be familiar with Masdar City. It began about 15 years ago with exactly this in mind, low carbon, zero carbon for certain measures. It's been an exciting journey on where we can achieve that, but really fortunately, this being the technology festival, I think it's been the role of technology to really facilitate some of that, both in terms of energy production, the efficiencies of photovoltaics, as well as the cost of photovoltaics have jumped so significantly, basically more than doubling in efficiency and halving in cost. So overall productivity of about 4 times really has enabled us to meet and achieve some of those goals. So today, the buildings that we're planning, actually the buildings that we're constructing today are actually functionally net zero, at least in terms of energy. The carbon offsets for embedded carbon is another challenge, which I think some of my other panelists will cover here, so I'll leave that. But fundamentally, I think as civilization evolves and as countries in the world evolves, there's much more international exposure to the effects of everything we do. So the early days of urbanism, it was really just to fix basic problems. I need to protect myself from weather, maybe some defensive systems, but it was always thinking very, very locally. Now everything that we do not only has global impact, but has global exposure. So if you want to be competitive in this landscape, you have to also be responsible into that international landscape in order to attract those investors. So fundamentally, this is something that's really bearing fruit for us now with so much focus on carbon, low carbon and carbon neutrality, that this being a big topic, as was mentioned earlier, COP28 coming to the UAE next year, as well as all the ESGs that are coming online. Companies have to be responsible, and then they will seek partners who will enable them to do so.
Do you think it's feasible? Do you think we're ready in terms of standards, in terms of regulations?
It's certainly feasible, and I think it starts fundamentally at the point at which we conceptualize cities and communities. And I think one thing sort of fundamentally that needs to change is we need to go away from monozoned communities. So we need to look a lot more at mixed-use communities, and this is obviously culturally something that we need to adapt so that the development, which is obviously market-led, goes in that direction. And it has more recently been popularized as the 15-minute city concept, where you provide amenities and facilities within walking distance or cycling distance or being able to use public transport. So it's creating these mixed-use communities, which are then connected by public transit, which allows people to rely more on walking and cycling. And then I think the one thing that we cannot discount is the power of just passive design, good design, in terms of aligning with the elements, sun, wind. I think the one thing that I find we do quite intuitively is sun, but the thing that we don't focus on as much as wind. And what I realized when I was doing some research on urban heat islands is that wind actually goes a really long way in reducing the urban heat island effect, because it's like blowing air on a hot cup of tea, right? And you dissipate the heat, and that reduces cooling demand of buildings, which is actually a huge carbon requirement in cities. So it's basically mobility and cooling that can be addressed quite sort of appropriately with the right urban form, the right means of movement, the right materials, and urban form.
I think Vasu is taking us to the heart of the matter. I think these two elements could be simulated and data could be gathered to help. And that's why today we're going to talk about digital twins. And we are also going to talk about the first mile and probably the last mile.
I think I want to build up on some of the topics you were mentioning at the beginning, and also my colleague here mentioned. First, can we achieve it? It's like a vision. We need to have that vision to be able to go toward it. Look where we are today and where we were 20 years ago, where all this didn't exist. So putting the vision ahead of us is critical. The second part is, how do we achieve it? And it's all about what do we plan, how do we construct it, and how do we use it? These are the three key elements. What do we plan? This is where the government and municipalities have a very much high impact. They control supply and demand. They can create mobility. They can create the transport that is required. Just mentioning, and my colleagues made it already, out of the COP26 themes, there was 2 out of 5 that municipalities and low carbon footprint can be achieved. There were discussions of themes around clothing, meats, consumption, but the 2 important that concerns us today here are around energy and transport, like my colleague mentioned. And this is around what do we build? It's a community housing, community cities. How do we make sure 15 or 20 minutes benchmark that happens around the world, that started back in the years in Australia and now is going around the world? And what do we need to make this happen? It's a combination of all the features that are required for a community housing and community living. It's around transport, education, jobs creation, and all this within your walking distance or short transport. And that will make the cities of the future, and that's what the discussions are happening in Bonn. And I believe these are one of the elements that can bring the low carbon footprint vision to reality. Riyadh, you have a very specific view on the modern construction and how it can bring to it.
And to us, it's really a transition. So it's a transition of people, equally as important as transition of technology. It's a transition of building capacity. You know, we've had lead certified engineers in the company for the last 12 years. We have within the group a sustainability consulting firm that does that for the industry and for ourselves. But what that does is it changes the DNA of the firm itself, and therefore everything from the pricing to the engineering to the execution to the procurement. As you build that capacity in a company, then you build the ability to deliver those solutions to market. One of the solutions that we're proud of is volumetric construction. We have 2 companies, DoBox and DoPod, and the reason I say that in this context of low carbon is because when you manufacture in a factory, when you design for manufacturing and you manufacture a building in a factory, then you control the process. And you cannot improve what you can't measure. And in a factory, you can measure. You can measure not just the cost and the time and the quality, but you can also measure the carbon footprint. And once you start measuring that carbon footprint, then you can start reducing it, looking at how to reduce it. And to me, or to us in the company, that will be a big step as we move forward in reducing the mechanism or the delivery of buildings in a lower carbon footprint. We may not reach 0 carbon footprint, it will be always offset, but at least when you start measuring, you can start improving.
Waleed, what's your intake on what has been said.
All sounds very exciting so far, and I think one of the challenges that we have in ROSHN is an added element on top of all this, that is the scale that we operate at, and then the scope or the boundary that we work in. So we operate inside existing cities. So even though we're master communities, master planned communities, that we have to integrate into existing infrastructures and existing models of transportation and whatnot. That usually puts limitations on us of what we can and what we're allowed to implement in terms of technologies and deviating from what the standard practice is. But I think a big picture for us is to prioritize, and that's the way that's what we're doing right now. If we look at overall data, and I like to reference what my colleague Riyadh just said, when we look at the data from Saudi Arabia, coming out of Saudi Arabia now, at least from the World Resource Institute, about 40% of carbon emissions come from electricity generation. Another 20% or so come from transportation, and another 16-17% come from manufacturing. And these three areas are the areas that intersect with what ROSHN does and ROSHN's business. There's also some on shipping, but it's only 3%, so we can ignore that for now. But understanding that number one issue is electricity, meaning the operation of the building, and number two is manufacturing, which is the manufacturing of the material of the building. So we focus on these two, and then we deploy the technologies and the digital tools to zoom in on these two items before we move on to something else. And that's where, at least at this phase into the decarbonization process, we will have the biggest impact, and we will have some more time to mature other technologies in other areas like transportation and shipping.
We know that the digital revolution now has been offering us some tools. Some of us are resisting these tools for probably a good reason, but others are really embracing these new tools. What do you think about that, Ian?
You know, the complexities in technology is just the various platforms, different processes, different procedures, no common unified standard of adoption. And I guess the luxury we have as a fairly major project and a fairly major developer is we can impose those standards. So I see David Glennon in the audience as a head of digital delivery. David is driven, take BIM as an example, where BIM was kind of partly adopted in the consultancy industry, heavily adopted by structural engineers, but...
Why do you think is the case?
You'll find various consultancy organizations over the last 5 years have adopted it almost wholeheartedly. But BIM's been around since early 1990s. I remember BIM technology coming out in probably 1988 and starting to get embraced in about 1994, 95. And we're sort of talking about it in the industry like it's something new. It's kind of fascinating. It's taken us this long to actually get adoption of the system on a wholehearted basis. And you still see global concerns around the world and manufacturers and suppliers who are reluctant to adopt. I find it quite fascinating. So it's quite astounding. So how do you do it? Eventually, governments, major employers have to impose the standards. So we've set the standard. We've imposed it. If you want to be on our list of suppliers, you have to engage with technology. You have to you have to build BIM models. That's all concerns. That's interior designers who are hugely reluctant to embracing the technology. MEP, not just doing some indicative one-line diagrams, but actually modeling what's actually going to get constructed, as opposed to passing that through the supply chain and leaving that to be designed later on by the likes of Amana, but leaving it to the contractors and the supply chain to actually do the design. We have to get the design done up front. It's got to be modeled. So we have a live BIM model on every project every week. All consultants have to update the model, which gives us full access then clearly to the simple issues of clash detection and the like as we're going through the early stages. But more importantly, we can start to simulate. We can start to simulate wind movements and passive cooling. We can start to model solar, which is partly guest experience. Are they going to get the right level of sunlight and shading in the resorts that we're building? So the BIM model starts to, it's clunky to start with, takes time to build, gets time to refine, but then if everyone's engaged with them, we've got 10 to 12 consultants per project, per building, all have to bring the information. Massive reluctance to do it, but don't work with us. If you don't want to do it, don't join the party. And eventually that's got engaged. And then, technology's embedded in our approach to making this a smart destination. We couldn't term it a smart city, so we coined an expression in 2017. We want this to be a smart destination, wholly technology enabled during construction, but more importantly, during operations, and also to enhance guest experience. So how can we get operational efficiencies? How can we get enhanced guest experience? So we have 45 platforms of smart technology. It's hugely complicated. We've got some of the best brains in the industry. We've got Cisco, Accenture, Oracle. We've got a host of people working with us in a great in-house team, wrestling with standardization. How do you get common platforms? How do you get access to source data? Everyone's hugely reluctant to share their data. How do you extract it? How do you insist on extracting it, assimilating it, storing it? Once we've got the data in a common format we can access, there's an infinite variety of things we can do. Someone's limited by your imagination. We've got our own views we've been evolving over the last 3-4 years, but this is going to go much further. The simulation of the environment during construction to support us, particularly on logistics, but more importantly, during operations, simulating that now to understand how these developments are going to perform over the next 10, 20 years is dependent on technology.
I totally agree with you, and I remember when contractors started using BIM, the consultants were reluctant. I think they were resisting it, but contractors have already seen the benefit, the coordination between the different sectors and so on. And Dubai municipality made it a mandate that you had to submit your documents for approval using BIM, Building Information Modeling. Sorry. But they were still using AutoCAD, I'm sorry, but AutoCAD is a very dumb, retarded software. When you compare it to BIM, I mean, whether you're using Revit or whatever, Riyadh, you told me that now BIM and parametrics and modular construction are now kind of syncing.
I mean, frankly, I don't think volumetric modular would be possible without BIM collaboration. I don't know how companies can do that, frankly. As a testimony to what Ian said earlier, we delivered a number of projects to the Red Sea Development Company in Saudi in a collaborative manner where it was the same model. We're using the same model, different users, whether it's the consultants, the client, the contractor, the subcontractor. And had there not been BIM at the center of it, there's no way you can deliver on that. So to us, from a technology point of view, two practical technologies we're seeing on the ground is BIM, clearly, and also IoT, Internet of Things. Today, we're using IoT not only in the factory itself, when we produce the volumetrics in DoBox and DoPod, but also we're shipping to clients smart pods. So pods that go out, say a bathroom pod that goes out already pre-installed with power, water, monitors, sewage if need be, air quality, temperature, so that the client can actually measure that carbon footprint. Again, back to measuring. You can't improve what you can't measure. Back to measuring the carbon footprint of that particular pod, whether it's a bathroom pod or it's a room pod or what have you. So to us, technology, if we don't start using it in slow dosage, of course, you cannot disrupt. Construction is not an easy sector to change, but you have to take it in dosages, step by step, and it starts with capacity building of the people within the organization so they can adopt it.
When you speak of IoT, Internet of Things, what comes to mind is collecting data as well. So, which takes us to digital twin. Okay, I'll invite the panel to talk about that. I mean, because BIM is actually a simulation, but digital twin is more than a simulation. So, What do you think about that? Is it realistic to create a, a digital copy of what you have?
So it's really in that tech adoption curve, each of these technologies have their place, and in all the various industries that actually build and deliver environments and cities, the value chain is broken, or the values are distributed in different ways. So maybe for contractors, it became much more interesting early on just because of the complexity of building sites and clashes and all that's going on. Whereas the clients weren't that interested in it because they had a building and the job was done. So it's really just building a new foundation, a new level for then other technologies to be able to leverage. So the question is one of value. Where do you capture the value of these new technologies? And slowly, with digital twins and all this, that value is becoming distributed amongst the whole delivery and operation chain into the entire life cycle. So for example, for Masdar, which some of the early designs came about 15 years ago, there was obviously technology was a little bit somewhere else, but we did some modeling as well. I mean, the basics of design haven't really changed, right? So as you mentioned, the city's aligned to breezes to help facilitate and kind of cutting down some of those basic requirements and to minimize the heat island. The interesting part for us is that we've already built several of these. So now we're able to actually go back and empirically measure the actual effects of those models. Granted, they were 15 years ago, so they weren't as accurate. But now we're able to see, like, okay, those decisions we made back then based on digital models, how well are they operating? How closely are they aligned to this? Which is the true evolution of how we build cities, right? Because we're fundamentally talking about a scientific method, right? The technologies are helping us measure to help us make better informed decisions so that we can make more efficient cities, also in the operation side.
This is the whole point. I think that digital twin is to save time. It's like while you're building, you can collect data, analyze it, and bring it back to I think that will bring us to something else, which is how, is once your building is approved, for instance, if we're talking about a building, and you have the building permit, and do you have the right to fix a few other things? Or do you have to go back to wherever, to get them approved and so on? So that's why I asked, do you believe, the first question, do you believe in carbon neutral, creating cities that are low carbon? And I will ask the rest of the panel the same question. You design cities, you use technologies. The tools, are they responsible for shaping our environments, built environments? Is there some of that in the design? We were discussing this, Vasu, how a pen works and how maybe if you're using VR, it's not a pen anymore. You're inside the city or inside a building. See, so it's a different story.
Being able to simulate how the city or the building is going to perform in the future is really powerful in helping us optimize. I will say, though, that it can go wrong sometimes. And the one example that I have is of traffic simulation, because we do it for every city in the Middle East, and it relies on a culture of driving. So it promotes a culture of driving. And I think it's sometimes you have to change the parameters to get the right output. And at the moment, if you run, the simulation of traffic per the requirements of local authorities, you get 6-lane highways. That doesn't promote walking and cycling. Obviously, it creates severance between communities. So sometimes that simulation needs to challenge the culture, and it needs to change the culture as a result. So I think we need to take it with a pinch of salt sometimes. We need to constantly challenge what parameters and what culture we're trying to promote through the technology and simulation.
Waleed, what's in your opinion about all this?
Yes. I think coming from the simulation background, when we talk about digital twins, my immediate thought is that there's an object and there's a digital twin to it. So the object is ready and then the twin is already designed and functioning. Now that could be correct or incorrect, but what I'd like to also draw here is that prior to that product being fully designed, there's a whole process for that design to mature. And during that process, it's a very messy, iterative, going back and forth and trying to fix things and revise things. Taking this back to the question of decarbonization, so if we wanted to look at this, and let's talk about operational carbon and embodied carbon. So we'll talk about the life cycle assessment of the building and also the energy simulation of the building. Both of these can be very easily facilitated by a digital twin or a BIM model, and that's great. And the lesser softwares we need to learn, the lesser platforms we need to operate, and the lesser files we need to manage, it'll be better for everybody. So if we can have one platform that draws from different databases, that'd be great. So an EPD online cloud database for the LCAs, and then another one for weather files for the energy, and maybe another one for either computational fluid dynamics or some other simulation object in order to achieve that net zero or decarbonization goal. This is a very valuable tool that I think it's going to take a little bit of time until it matures. But I think the issue that I just wanted to raise was that there's a lot of messiness towards the beginning, and I know that BIM has different levels of detail, and maybe it could be captured during that. So before it comes to maturity level 400, I think, and I'm not a BIM person, but I think the value is still there. And one of the things we struggle is that we tend to rebuild models time and time again, each time we want to investigate a specific attribute of a building, just because all these digital services don't talk to each other. There are some workarounds where we can streamline it, but they're usually not, they don't work very seamlessly together.
Just wanted to add is that technologies that we're discussing, and I will get into digital twin specifically, but all technologies are specific features that impact and influence the total value chain, like my colleague from Masdar was mentioning before. The construction and the setup and the design happens over 2 years, sometimes 4 years at the beginning, but the lifetime of what we construct is another 30 years of utilization, consumption, carbon footprint, and energy consumption. So what we do and invest at the beginning is critical for the next 20 to 30 years. So is it something we believe in? Yes. Is it something worth investing in? Yes. And we can develop on all the wastage that happens in construction, but those digital twins allows you to project yourself in the future and see all the shadows, the wind, the carbon footprint that will happen during the maintenance and lifetime of this construction. So
the elephant in the room is privacy. I mean, who gets access to data, and who gets to process it, and so on. If that data is, I imagine at the city level, I mean, there should be some, we should be using data with a lot of caution, really. So that's also another element we need to look at. I would like you to tell us something about the last mile. Do you think it's evolving? Are we getting better? Less congestion, less noise, less pollution?
I think I said earlier, we're forcing people to walk and forcing people to cycle as a start. We're prohibiting carbon-based vehicular transport systems to actually come into the center of developments itself. It's becoming electrified, clearly. Whether electrification is just a temporary measure and eventually hydrogen wins out. I think hydrogen probably wins out in the marine environment. The electric's really struggling to make any significant impact. Speeds are so slow. Everyone switches on their big diesel Rolls-Royce engines sooner as they come out of the port at 5 knots under electric solar. But hydrogen offers some real advantages. Hydrogen embedded in hulls of vessels. I think hydrogen is going to find much more place in land transport systems. So maybe we're going to go through a transitory phase and we'll eventually find the right fuel type that's going to work for us. But it's prohibiting, vehicular access. It's forcing people. We are prohibiting any carbon-based vehicle movement onto our islands, into our main site. It's purely electric to start with. I don't think that's the end game, though. I think it's going to move on. In terms of, we're using seaplanes to get people and helicopters to other islands, but eVTOLs are clearly heading that way. We're future-proofing our airport and our landing sites at each of the resort destinations, assuming that technology is converging very fast. There's a lot of legislation issues around it, but it's happening very quickly. It won't be too long before we start seeing that generally adopted for people movement, not just goods movement.
I'll just add a little bit to that. We all had an interesting 2 years or so where in Masdar we used to jokingly say that we're going to design for the last meter as opposed to the last mile, as there was a lot of lockdown and most of our transportation happened between the kitchen and some kind of makeshift office within so we've all experienced that. But really the part of the last mile is how do we organize these questions, right? How do we define the problems? What are the problems that we seek and try to resolve? Because, for example, the 15-minute city, the last mile is also the first mile, potentially. So maybe that completely changes the dynamic. The mixed-use communities which essentially enable that. One of the things we're talking about at Masdar, kind of inspired by some of this COVID lifestyle, is not only a mixed use but multi-use. So as some of the infrastructure that we're investing embedded carbon and operational carbon in, can it be used for multiple purposes? Can we layer values? Can you generate power on top, perhaps do an agrivoltaic food production, then do residential, and then use the ground floor for other purposes as well, and then throughout the cycle of the day to take advantage of most of that. So it's really how do you organize these kind of paradigms? And I do think there is a paradigm shift. We were talking about it a little bit, is what is this new normal? Because when these new needs came up, particularly in the delivery industry, I think we all adopted it very quickly. Now everybody just orders things much quicker. But the overall point, as we're organizing those problems, I think we should just also be cognizant that not everything is about efficiency, and that's why a lot of the livability questions are coming up as well. Because we can be in our very curated bubbles and live absolute comfort, but we start to miss some of those things that actually contribute to everyday life. So maybe it is that you're speaking about dropping your children off, like, okay, maybe you could have just put them in a pod and they would be gone. But some of those, things that are kind of left over.
Wishful thinking.
Some of those gaps that we actually fill with kind of that mundane daily life, that's where some of the real values is. That's where the interpersonal relationships happen. That's where, we all kind of miss those water cooler moments. And, thanks for the organizers that were able to have a face-to-face event where I can meet, fascinating people and have a quick chat over coffee, which doesn't really happen on Zoom and Teams, although it would be, very efficient and save a drive.
I can tell you, Lukas, that now in VR you create a room, you create avatars, and we can all meet and have a project and work on it. My students who are computer freaks, they do that all the time. I mean, they go inside the room and people from different parts of the world, they meet there, and so it's possible, it's coming.
Yeah, thank you very much for this amazing panel. Zakaria Osman from SAFE. Just we have 2 questions. One question is the main target for the carbon emission or low carbon. It is the percentage, how much we have to save yearly from the construction or from the operation. So my question here, from the feasibility study of the huge project like Red Sea, how much the target of the reduction or the mitigation of the carbon? This is one thing. Second things for the during the construction, especially in fabrication and model. So we know the carbon emission or the carbon reduction, it will come from manpower, energy, and so on. From your experience or from your previous project, how much the reduction of the manpower or of the energy consumption or if, material during using the model, fabrication model?
Red Sea, we're off grid with our energy supplies. There was no infrastructure there when we started the project in 2017. There's no infrastructure for power. There's no infrastructure for water. Everything that we're doing, 50,000 cubic meters a day of water, 200 megawatt of power in the first phase, that goes up as we do phases 2 and 3, is driven by us. So we will save by being off grid, totally solar driven, an entire solar renewable network of generation. We will save around 500,000 tons of carbon per year purely by being off grid. Nothing to do with the way we look at embodied carbon in buildings, the way we approach constructability and the materiality we use, green concrete, other uses of advanced materials. But so the figure is extraordinary, but the proof is going to be in measuring it. So we've done a lot to put the framework of targeting, measuring, and we're about to invite third-party, I suppose, scrutiny or accreditation to some extent of those figures. It's no good us saying what we're doing. We need it verifying, and I think that process will also challenge us to go further. So our goals are extraordinarily high, and it comes a bit like trying to get to zero carbon. If you don't set massive, audacious goals, you're not going to get anywhere along the line. It's best to be set 100% of zero land infill, zero target on carbon, and get somewhere close to it rather than setting a moderate target. So all of our targets we're setting are extraordinary. So the targets for carbon saving are extraordinary. We're doing a lot of offsetting, carbon sequestration with mangrove planting and tree planting. We've got around 20 million trees and shrubs to plant in the phase 1, but we've just planted 500,000 mangroves. We've got 1 million to plant, and mangroves are a massive sequester of carbon, much more than multiples of Amazon rainforest capability, hundreds times, potentially thousands times more sequestration than the rainforest. So hugely important. We've underestimated, I think, when we started the project, the significance of mangroves, of seagrass, of a lot of the natural materials that are already there. So how do we enhance that on a massive scale? We haven't actually set an horizon for that because it can carry on for decades and decades.
So our history, we go back almost over 12 years in volumetric construction, and we're good in collecting data. And our data has shown we've constructed well over 700,000 square meters perhaps in volumetrics. And our data shows from a material point of view, you have to look at the wastage because you cannot reduce the material, the building is the building, but the wastage goes down by over 30% in material. The efficiency or the productivity, if you want, goes up by 40%. You have less people at the factory and they're doing repetitive skills. So therefore your productivity is much better than at site. So both of those, we've seen them and we've been measuring them over the years, and these are KPIs that we measure as a way to progress the. So from a business model, yes, you reduce the carbon footprint of the construction of it because you're doing it in a repeatable and measurable manner. But the material is the material of the building. You don't have a say over that. That comes from the design side of things. But you do reduce the wastage by over 30%.
I would like to add a little thing here. Architects like to think effectiveness, and engineers like to think efficiency. And sometimes, these two things meet. And I think if you combine, because with modular structures and modular buildings and so on, you do them off-site, of course, it's more efficient. But with modular design comes limitations, in terms of design. But parametric design offers, that you go, removes that limitation. And that could be one way of looking at it.
Hello, my name is Dr. Zafar Khan. I'm from Zuhair Faiz Partnership Consultants, KSA. My question is a little bit on the overview or macroscopic level about city planning. I think it would be interesting to know the opinion of the learned panel on the city planning as regards the sizes of the city. Means, is it still feasible of thinking about large cosmopolitan cities and trying to put effort in their making the infrastructure sustainable, low carbon emission oriented, or it is more advisable to think about smaller interconnected cities, and what, in your opinion, would be the pros and cons of each approach?
I mean, look, there's a big debate. You know, there's the triumph of the city on one side from Professor Glaser, and then recently there's been the discussion of the death of the city, kind of brought up by COVID and kind of this fact that people could work remotely. Personally, I think my opinion is there's a little bit of something in both those answers. Partially, I don't think that there's one model that will suit everybody's lifestyle. Two, the economic typologies are not always there. Sometimes you don't want to put certain resources there and certain numbers. I think what's starting to happen is there is a kind of a sweet spot scale similar to construction. If we're looking at this from a carbon perspective, you know, density is definitely more efficient, but at the same time, once we get to a certain level, you start to bring on external factors that then start to affect livability. So what you also find is that demographically, certain cities suit certain people or age types or well, demographics per se. So I think it's really healthy to have various scales of cities, definitely interconnected. We are, you know, nobody talks about globalization anymore. Like, we haven't heard that term probably in 15, 20 years, right? Because it's essentially happened. So interconnectedness is definitely critical for resilience, but I don't think there's one model that will fit and serve all with just general principles that are universal.
Urbanization is happening. If you look at the statistics, by 2050, 70% of the world population is going to be living in cities. And most of these people are attracted to existing cities because you have the, you know, economy there for attracting the people. So new cities in general are quite difficult to take off. In terms of looking at existing cities, obviously there isn't one answer for every element of the city, but it is more around how we distribute densities in cities. So how we look at creating dense nodes around transit systems. Looking at some things which get centralized, like cooling. I think we've seen a growth of district cooling in general, and that helps saving energy rather than having individual chiller plants in every building. But then some things may be decentralized, like for instance, sewage treatment should be potentially more decentralized so that the TSC can be reused locally. So there are different, I think, solutions for different things, and there isn't one answer that we're going to be able to provide for our cities of the future. I think whatever suits and optimizes carbon is probably the way to go.
Regionalization of cities is what is happening. And you will see that more and more, there's even a website called citywalk.com, which focuses on where is the best place to live for low carbon. And it all goes into between city center, outskirts, and rural. The city center too condensed, creates too much carbon footprint. The outskirts too far away creates too much transportation. So it's a combination of regionalization of those cities and the ability to create communities that are self-surviving for 80% of your daily needs. That's what the future looks like. And alignment to what my colleagues were mentioning is also the centralization of energy for each one of these sub-regions, which basically focuses on transport and energy, where municipalities and low carbon footprint ambition will be and is driving towards.
Thank you so much.